and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. I'm your host, Dave Vance. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Our guest here tonight is popular radio show host KrisAnne Hall. On tonight's show, we will begin with a conversation with KrisAnne and then follow up with our usual announcements and updates, including my special commentary on our state's addiction to federal funding for education and all its ramifications. So let's get right ahead and go into it. For those of you not familiar with KrisAnne Hall, here's a little background information on our special guest. Constitutional attorney KrisAnne Hall brings you current events from a historical, constitutional, and principled perspective. Liberty over security, principle over party, and truth over personality. KrisAnne received her bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Blackburn College and her Juris Doctor from the University of Florida College of Law. She served in the U.S. Army as a military intelligence cryptologic linguist and was a prosecutor for the state of Florida for nearly a decade. KrisAnne also worked with a prominent national First Amendment law firm where she traveled the country defending Americans whose rights were violated by unlawful arrest and prosecutions. KrisAnne is one of the most sought-after national speakers on the Constitution, averaging over 250 events in nearly 22 states every year for 5 years straight. She has written 6 books on American history and the U.S. Constitution and is now a professor at River University School of Government. KrisAnne is a regular consultant on the Constitution for numerous radio podcasts and television programs. She has been seen on Victory News, Flashpoint, Newsmax, Fox News, Court TV, and has been interviewed by C-SPAN In Depth, and her books and classes have been featured on C-SPAN Book TV. KrisAnne has a nationally popular radio show with an international following for the last 6 years. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you on. I really appreciate you making time for us.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, let's get right into the questions. I mentioned to you before we started that nullification is an issue. I think it's one of the key things that we have to do in our country if we're going to have any chance of saving it. And here in Tennessee, we're focusing on some nullification legislation that will be coming back this session. And a lot of people don't know much about nullification. So what are some of the strongest proofs from our history that the founders expected the states to use nullification when the federal government overreaches?
I do want to mention that I have written an entire book on this subject, actually. It's called Sovereign Duty, and you can get it on Amazon. You can get it at KrisAnneHall.com. But the book not only outlines the fundamental foundation of nullification as it creates as a self-existing principle based on how the states are created, how the Constitution is created, how the federal government is created. But I have over 180 citations in the back of the book. So I literally give you not just simply the explanations, but all of the research that I have behind it located within original text documents. So everything that we're about to talk about is available in the book Sovereign Duty. And I also have courses at libertyfirstsociety.com where I actually teach these things. So what I'm really going to be giving you as an explanation to your questions are quotes and principles and teachings that all come from our teaching platform of libertyfirstsociety.com. So nullification is a very simple concept to understand, but it becomes complicated because we lack foundational understanding. Basic foundational understanding about who we are. We stopped teaching foundational explanations on the Constitution, its proper role of government, the proper application of the Constitution in 1830. So the explanation becomes a little bit more complicated because you have to kind of go back and lay foundations that our founders took for granted as fact and basic understanding. But the top 3 arguments, and I wouldn't say arguments, I'd probably use your word proofs, right? Because that's a better thing, because an argument means there's some disagreement, right. Some legitimate disagreement, but a proof establishes a truth. And the first would be that the Constitution itself is a contract. And it's not a contract between the people and the federal government. It's not a contract between the states and the federal government. The Constitution is a contract between the states that creates the federal government, which establishes the states as a higher power and the federal government as a lower power, which is also upheld in Madison's Federalist 45 and in the words of the Declaration of Independence themselves. So what you have, and in the 10th Amendment as well. So the Constitution as a contract establishes what is the foundational support for federal power. And the fact that the states are the creators means that they have ultimate control over their creation. So that's basic principle number one. The other reason is that our founders actually told us that nullification is how we're supposed to be handling this. For example, I have here a quote from James Madison, written in 1800 in his Virginia Assembly report that said, "If the decisions of the judiciary be raised above the authority of the sovereign parties to the Constitution, which are the states," he says, "dangerous powers not delegated may not only be usurped and executed by other departments, but that the judicial department also may exercise and sanction dangerous powers beyond the grant of the Constitution. Consequently, that the ultimate right of the states to judge whether the Constitution has been dangerously violated must extend to violations by one delegated authority as well as by another, by the judiciary as well as the executive or the legislative." So what Madison is explaining to us is that it's not the judiciary that's the ultimate authority on the meaning and the application of the Constitution. It's actually the states that are the ultimate authority. You have James Wilson, who was also commenting during the ratification debates. He says the power of the Constitution predominates, and anything that shall be enacted by Congress contrary thereto will not have the force of law. And it's very interesting because Alexander Hamilton, which is probably considered to be the most big government guy that we had at that time, was also in favor of nullification. And he said there is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of a delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. So what we have to understand is that the states created the federal government, and as the creators of the federal government, they determined the limited and defined boundaries of the federal government, and they are the ultimate arbiters of whether that creation has violated its boundaries or not. And then the third final would be that they actually used nullification. They used nullification during the Sedition and Alien Acts, the Alien and Sedition Acts under President John Adams.
Yep.
And then they also used nullification quite successfully in the tariff crisis of 1829, which, by the way, is what was the catalyst to the recreation of the standard of teaching on how the federalism of America was supposed to work. It was that nullification crisis, they called it actually in 1829, that prompted the uber nationalists to rewrite the textbooks on the Constitution itself.
Wow. I've never heard that.
Yeah.
Okay, if there's people that oppose nullification, so what reasonable method would states have to push back against the federal overreach if we didn't have nullification? Because the current method is to go to the federal courts and beg the federal courts to do the right thing, essentially. Ask the federal government to limit the federal government.
Yeah, and that's really the point, and that's the thing that James Madison was pointing out in the Virginia Assembly Report of 1800, right? It's not to the states to go beg the federal government, to beg the judiciary to see their side, right? You don't have to, if you are the state, you don't have to sue the federal government to give back to you something that already belongs to you. That's just ludicrous. It's not only ludicrous, it's dangerous because, as you pointed out, I mean, most Americans know from basic civics that the federal government is created of three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. To run to the courts to determine the limits of the federal government is to ask part of the federal government determine the limit of the federal government, which means that the only limit to federal power is itself, which is, again, not what our founders anticipated nor intended, because a government whose only limit of its power is itself is a kingdom.
Absolutely.
And that's not what we are. So nullification is not the only remedy. It is the most powerful remedy. It is the most immediately powerful remedy. But the other remedies would be the state's control over the federal budget, the refusal to fund the federal government in the exercise of unauthorized powers, which quite unfortunately was eliminated through the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment did away with the Constitution's provision of apportionment that made the states in charge of the power of the purse over the federal government. Another check and balance would be the recall of senators. So the 17th Amendment obliterated that check and balance because prior to the 17th Amendment, all the state senators worked for the states that they were hired by and were subject to, they were principally at-will employees. So prior to the 17th Amendment, they were assigned a term in office, but any time while in office, they could be immediately recalled by the state if they failed to represent the state in those matters.
Yeah, I would love to see both of those, the 16th and 17th, done away with. Ultimately, I think that has to happen if we're ever to have a chance.
It would have to be done in a particular order, though, because you're never going to be able to repeal the 16th Amendment until you repeal the 17th Amendment. So you would have to place the senators back on recall in order to get to get the momentum to eliminate the 16th Amendment. When you understand why the 16th Amendment exists, why it was created post the war between the states, you understand that Congress created the 16th Amendment because they didn't want to let go of the income stream that was created during the Civil War. And so in order to get rid of the 16th Amendment, you would have to have Congress really agree to defund itself. And that won't happen unless there's some other recourse, which would be recall of the senators for refusing to abolish or even eliminate the 16th Amendment.
Yeah. When did we allow the Supreme Court to be considered the final arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution?
About the mid-1800s, actually, sometime before the Dred Scott Affair in 1857. But remember, I told you that it's when we fundamentally changed how we were taught the proper role of government, the proper separation of powers between the state and the federal government. We started rewriting that textbook in 1830 as a result of the nullification crisis of 1829. You see, the uber nationalists under Daniel Webster and his crew were just aghast at the fact that Congress had to bow down to South Carolina and the states that were opposed to what they called the unconstitutional tariff. And the rewriters of history try to claim that Andrew Jackson's threat of bringing in troops to force compliance of the tariff was really the catalyst. That really was not true. That's just the rewrite by what I call the federal supremacists. The reality is that the southern states that were being adversely impacted by this unconstitutional tariff came to an agreement with Congress that Congress would repeal and rewrite the tariff and the southern states would go along with the tariff for a short period of time until the tariff was recalled and rewritten, which was like an extremely short period of time. And so what the federal supremacists saw, and make no mistakes, the states themselves saw, was that the nullification of that tariff by the states had the exact effect it was supposed to have. It created a platform for negotiation and even control by the states over an unconstitutional federal act. So the federal supremacists, the uber nationalists under Webster, didn't want that to repeat itself. They didn't want the federal government to lose power. As a matter of fact, Daniel Webster was on the side of actually growing federal power and reducing state authority. They enlisted a Supreme Court justice by the name of Joseph Story to write a treatise on how the Constitution is to be interpreted and be applied. Joseph Story, a Supreme Court justice, injected his own concepts of judicial supremacy, however slight they may be. I fully believe he knew that by the principle of precedence that they would grow and grow and grow, strengthening the federal government and strengthening the judiciary itself. What most people don't know, even those who actually may know about Joseph Story's treatise on the federal government, is that it actually replaced an actual treatise on the federal government written by the people who wrote the Constitution. So there was an initial treatise on the federal government written on the Constitution itself and what each means and how it's to be applied, and the role of the federal government, the role of the states, even including principles like nullification, was written by a founder by the name of St. George Tucker. St. George Tucker was an attorney. Although he wasn't on the Constitutional Convention, he was actually a very vital part of drafting the language. And he was the one who decided that, hey, we're not going to have a fractured legal system like we had in England, where I'm actually going to start us off right with a treatise that explains not just simply what the Constitution says, but the meaning behind everything that we wrote. And he was the best person to do that since he was there and involved in all of the drafting.
And most people have never heard of him, and fewer have read any of them. I've only recently heard of him myself and done some reading, but I need to do a lot more, and that name needs to be out there because we need to go back to the basics. What are some of the biggest misunderstandings people have about nullification and state sovereignty?
Well, I think I wouldn't put them like in order of importance or order of egregiousness, if I can invent that word, if it's not a word already. But I would say there are three most common. And the most commonly used is, I think, probably the most, well, I mean, they're all inaccurate, but the most commonly used is that nullification is people choosing to violate the law. Nullification is not someone choosing to violate the law. Nullification is not, I don't like this law, so I'm not going to obey this law. Nullification is not a disobedience of any law, as a matter of fact. When nullification is properly applied, it is actually the enforcement of the Constitution because the government is disobeying the supreme law of the land. It's why Jefferson, let me pull up this, see if I have this quote by Jefferson. It's why Jefferson wrote that, I think I have this here. Right. He said, the several states who formed the Constitution, being sovereign and independent, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infractions, and that a nullification by those sovereignties of all unauthorized acts done under the color of that instrument is the rightful remedy. So nullification is not just simply picking and choosing which laws you don't want to follow. Nullification is understanding when the government is using the Constitution as an excuse to engage in acts that are not authorized by the Constitution. It's why Hamilton said that all acts contrary to the Constitution are invalid. It's why James Wilson said they do not carry the force of law and that sort of thing. So nullification, just to sum it up, nullification is not a disobedience of the law. Nullification is an enforcement of the supreme law of the land when the government around us is violating that supreme law. Now, the other two stem from the misteaching, miseducation, and misapplication of the Supremacy Clause. So the Supremacy Clause is Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution, and it is referred to as the Supremacy Clause. And most people, even federal lawyers and judges, and I'm going to say federal lawyers, all lawyers, because this is what we teach in the law schools now. We are taught in the law schools that the Supremacy Clause makes the federal government and federal laws supreme to state government and state laws whenever they conflict. That's the key. So whenever they conflict, they say the Supremacy Clause makes the federal government supreme. Well, that's not true at all. They'll say that the Supremacy Clause prohibits nullification because it automatically establishes the federal government as supreme. The second aspect of that is that they say that the Supremacy Clause makes the federal government supreme, right? Well, the Supremacy Clause is taught that, and they're able to get away with that because they base that on the understanding that nobody's going to read the Supremacy Clause. One of the greatest deceptions that have fallen on the American people is this lie that we are too dumb to read and understand the Constitution. You shouldn't even try. You're not a scholar. You're not a law student. You're not a judge. You're not a think tank. You're not a politician. You can't possibly understand the Constitution. You've got to leave that to us. We'll teach you what it says. And so the majority of Americans, quite unfortunately, have fallen prey to that deception. And they're intimidated. I mean, literally intimidated to pick up the Constitution. And once they do, they doubt everything they actually see. And so one of the things, like I said, all of these are my classes on libertyfirstsociety.com. I have a brief explanation of it in the book Sovereign Duty. But one of the things that I love doing in my classes is actually walking through the Supremacy Clause. It's not very long. It's very straightforward. It tells you exactly what it means. And it tells you that the Supremacy Clause does not make the federal government supreme. It makes the Constitution supreme. That's why it's called the Supremacy Clause. It establishes the Constitution as supreme and everything else subordinate to it. And you can see it in the text there itself. It says the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. You see, federal acts of government, EOs by the president, even Supreme Court opinions are not the supreme law of the land unless they comply with the Constitution. That's why judges are not the arbiters of the meaning of the Constitution. The Constitution is the meaning of the Constitution, and because the Constitution is a contract, by the way, the judges don't get to define the terms of the contract. The terms of the contract are defined by contract law to be defined by those who wrote the contract. So those who wrote and ratified the Constitution are the ones who determine the meaning to the Constitution, not judges 250 years later. Now, you'll love this because if you put the Supremacy Clause back up there, I want to show you how the Supremacy Clause teaches nullification. Okay? So, it says, the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties which shall be made under the authority of the United States, which is pursuant to the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Now, there is a way, just through grammar, for us to understand the full scope of this meaning. So the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. That's subordinate clause number 1. Subordinate clause number 2 is the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. Subordinate clause number 2. Subordinate clause number 3 is that treaties that are made pursuant to the Constitution are the supreme law of the land, and the judges shall be bound there, and the states shall be bound thereby. Now watch. The laws of the United States which shall not be made in pursuance thereof, and treaties made which shall be made not under the authority of the United States shall not be the supreme law of the land, and the states shall not be bound by them. You see, if an act of the government is not made in pursuance to the Constitution, Article 6, Clause 2 establishes that the states are not bound by it.
Absolutely. I've known that they've, they always overlook the portion where it says in pursuance thereof.
Right.
But it follows that, okay, if this is what it takes to make it legal, then if it doesn't meet that standard, it's illegal. And
Yeah, but I mean, it's not even more than it's actually more plain spoken than that. I mean, if it was just made in pursuance thereof, then you might have arguments about what that means. But the clause goes on to say that you're not bound by this. The only time the states are bound by what the federal government says is if what they say is in direct agreement with the Constitution. If it's not in direct agreement with the Constitution, the states are not bound.
And I've got one last question for you.
Okay.
If states fail to start using nullification, what do you see happening in the near future?
Well, how about if I let Thomas Jefferson answer that question for us?
Sure.
He says, when all government, domestic and foreign, in as little as great things shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another. Now notice he said one government on another, not one branch on another. He's speaking of the separation of power between the state and the federal government. The same thing that Madison talks about in Federalist 39 and Federalist 50. He says, if the states, elaborating on that check of one government on another, if the states look with apathy on this silent descent of their government into the gulf which is to swallow all, we have only to weep over the human character formed uncontrollable but by a rod of iron. So basically what Jefferson is saying is when the states refuse to engage in nullification, what they actually do is they transform themselves into colonies, and they transform the federal government into a kingdom.
And talk about complicity. We got plenty of that going on. Hey, I really appreciate...
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really not complicity, it's extortion at this point. It is, because the federal government is actually extorting power from the states through the illusion of federal funding. And I am very clear to say illusion of federal funding, because federal funding doesn't fund anything. Federal funding bankrupts.
Right.
And I've actually got several local governments to do a test, and they have found my theory to be true, which I know is not a theory because I've been involved in federal government, I've been involved in state government. But every federal money that is sent to us costs us more to receive than what we get. When you audit the federal money that comes in, you have to account for the fact that, number one, there's somebody at the state or local level that has to be hired to do that. to manage and maintain and disperse that money. There has to be an agency that does that. In those agencies and those people who work in the disbursement, management, maintenance of that federal funding, there are federal regulations, a whole bunch of red tape that has to be followed. Not only that, you oftentimes have to hire people to apply for that federal funding and get that federal funding. So anywhere from tens of dollars to tens of thousands of dollars for every $1 you get to the federal government. That's what it's going to cost your state.
Wow. And we don't hear about that part too often. Well, hey, thank you for joining us tonight. Love to have you back. Your website is KrisAnneHall.com.
Yes.
And a lot of great information on there. And tell me again, what was the name of that book that you mentioned at the beginning of the show?
Sovereign Duty.
Sovereign Duty. Okay. Okay, and I definitely want to look that up. Well, we hope to get you here in person to Tennessee in the next few months.
That would be
I talked to
fabulous.
you earlier, working on that, and I will get back with you just as quick as I can. Hey, thanks again. I know you were swamped, so I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You have a good night.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's time for updates and announcements, followed by some commentary. If you have an announcement from a conservative organization that you'd like announced on this show, please send the information to tninformer.tv@gmail.com the Friday before the show. The Stewart County GOP will hold their monthly meeting this Thursday, 6:30 p.m. at the Stewart County Visitor Center in Dover, Tennessee. That's 117 Visitor Center Lane. The Tennessee Committee for the Bill of Rights will hold their 21st annual Bill of Rights banquet Friday, December 15th at Trinity Chapel, 240 First Avenue, Dayton, Tennessee. This year's keynote speaker is Senator Janice Bowling. Paid reservations are $40 for adults, children under 12 or 20. Send check by December 1st to June Griffith, 265 Crestview Lane, Dayton, Tennessee, 37321. Meals will be provided by Evelyn's Catering. For good conservative talk radio, tune in to 105.3 WDXE radio in Lawrenceburg. From 5 to 6 p.m. on Mondays for the Kip Capley Show and Wednesdays from 5 to 6 p.m. for the local GOP radio show hosted by Chair of the Lawrence County GOP, Brandon Taylor, and Lawrence Sutton, the Secretary of the Lawrence County GOP. And now on Fridays with Free Speech News featuring Lawrence Sutton and Chris Morris, the Chair of the Giles County GOP and an SEC member from 5 to 6 p.m. If you want our state to step up and push back on our overreaching, often unconstitutional federal government, visit tncss.weebly.com and learn more about the legislation we hope to get passed this session that creates multiple processes for nullifying unconstitutional federal actions. There's no cost, it's an informational site, but we'd like for you to click on the Substack tab to sign up. We need as many as we can get to show support for this effort. Please talk to your state rep and state senator now and get their commitment to support this very important piece of legislation. And remember two things. Nullification is a responsibility, not a theory. And our state legislature just 2 years ago declared their right and responsibility to nullify unconstitutional actions by any branch of the federal government with the passage of SJR 9005. Now it's time to put some teeth in the 10th. I'm going to do a little bit of commentary on federal funding of K-12 education in Tennessee. If you remember several months back, the Speaker of the House, Cameron Sexton, suggested that Tennessee forego federal funding for K-12 education in Tennessee. I think that's a great idea. I'm all for suspending federal funding from Tennessee schools. We do need a just say no policy on federal funding for education and everything else too. Now, he suggested replacing the federal funds with state dollars. Federal funds account for about 10% of our K-12 funding statewide. 10%. We should be able to do that. Keep in mind that our state prides itself, our legislatures all of them will tell you how fiscally responsible our state is and how we balance our budget every year. Well, that's one of the few provisions in our state constitution that they actually uphold, okay? They do balance the budget. There's a little more to that though, and we'll get to that here in a second. Federal funds are used mainly to support low-income students English language learning, and disabled children, in addition to rural education and charter school technology. Now, everything I'm telling you is from a recent online newspaper article about the panel that met and discussed cutting cutting federal funding for state K through 12. And they haven't made, I guess, a final decision, but it's not looking like they want to do that. And I think they will finalize it no later than the 9th of January. It may go beyond that. But these are some of the things that have come out of these hearings so far. So back to where it says federal funds are used mainly to support low-income students, English language learning, and disabled children, in addition to rural education and charter school technology. So a couple things here. Federal funds, we already have welfare. So I don't understand what the federal funds, how the federal funds are used for low-income students. In any event, how is that not a state responsibility? There's nothing in the federal Constitution that makes education a federal responsibility. It's not one of the enumerated powers. So that shouldn't even come into play. English language learning. Well, we end up with a lot of kids who need to learn the English language in this country because they're from other countries and they came here illegally. Whether that's recently with the Biden open borders or if that was years ago, because let's not forget that our U.S. Supreme Court decades ago decided that states are responsible for educating the children of illegal aliens. Even though they broke the law to come here, our Supreme Court told our states, and our states have accepted, that we have to fund the education of these children. Well, if they can't speak English, they have to be taught English first. That's an additional cost, and that's another example of big government. That's another example of using our tax dollars for another example of their failing to uphold their end of the bargain as far as the federal government goes and securing the border. Disabled children. Once again, everybody cares about disabled children, but why is that a federal responsibility? If it needs to be done, it should be done by the state. Rural education. Okay, well, I don't understand why rural education would cost any more than education anywhere else. Matter of fact, I would think education in places like Nashville, Memphis, and Knoxville is even more expensive. So why do we have to have federal funds for rural education and charter school technology? If we're going to do charter schools, can we not fund our own charter schools? It's a state responsibility, not a federal responsibility. Recent hearing on education funding is an example, in my opinion, of how federal dollar addiction creates complicity with federal overreach. The Senate Education Chairman, John Lundberg, who claims to be a Republican, opposes turning down $1.3 billion in education funds, but would like to seek waivers and block grants if possible. Anytime that we work with the federal government to do something that is not a federal responsibility, we do something to increase their power or increase our dependence on them, on the federal government, that's our state being complicit. So since education is not a federal responsibility, when we rely on them for federal dollars to fund our education system, we're being complicit in that, in my opinion. Other Republican leaders warned that if the state were to forgo the money, Tennessee taxpayer dollars would go to other states. Well, okay, also those chains would go to other states. Every time you do something with the federal government, it comes with chains. You don't get all that money for free. Okay, you get the money, you get the federal chains. Besides that, not every state participates with every federal program at the same level. So it's not as if Tennessee is necessarily getting the same amount of federal funding for all the other programs as every other state. In some cases, we might get more. In some cases, we might get less on other programs. So to act as if, oh, well, somebody else will get our taxpayer dollars, that's ridiculous. And if that's your standard, you'll never say no to any federal program. Opposition to ending federal funding tells us how lightly many in our office take their oath, but also how short-sighted they are as well. Our state legislators take an oath to uphold the state and U.S. Constitution. Education, like most issues the federal government funds, has indebted our citizens for is not a, let me just clarify that. Most of the things that we are in debt for by our federal government are not even constitutional to begin with. They're not things that the federal government is authorized to do. They're not part of the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, or anywhere else in the Constitution. So for us to continually to rely on them for education and pick a topic, all that does is add to the debt. Now, all of our politicians at the state level, in addition to bragging on how responsible they are with our money, will tell you how irresponsible the federal government is. They'll talk about the deficit. They'll talk about the debt. They'll talk about now the interest on the debt, which is nearing $1 trillion. That's just the interest every year. So why our state would think that we can continue long-term to rely on federal funding is beyond me. We know it's going to crash at some point in time. Why not figure out now what's important, what we have to fund in education, and start funding it ourselves instead of waiting for that moment that we all know is going to come when the federal government crashes, when our dollar is worthless, and when we find out, hey, you're not going to get all that federal money you've been relying on all these years. Why not take it upon ourselves now? The responsible thing to do would be to figure out, okay, what do we absolutely have to do to fund our own education? It's only 10% of the total budget that we're getting anyway. Do that now instead of waiting for a crash and waiting to find out that we've got to all of a sudden come up with that. Once again, most the federal government does, most of the biggest drivers of our debt are things that they're not even supposed to be doing. Now, I know it's unlikely that the state's going to go cold turkey on all federal funding at once, but K-12 education is one area that we should do so immediately. Like I said, it's a state responsibility. Anytime our state participates in unconstitutional federal programs, they are complicit. Federal education initiatives are poisoning our children's minds. You talk about the DEI, the CRT, the whole pro-trans movement, all that's coming from the federal government. Why would we want our kids in that system? If we end federal funding, that ends the federal change. Stop trading our children's minds and souls for federal dollars. The federal government's broke. Acting as if the federal government will always be able to provide funding ignores the train wreck that's coming. If these things are so vital, our legislature should find a way to fund them. The other argument, one other thing I do want to point out, Tennessee, in reference to the argument that other states will get our tax dollars, Tennessee currently gets about 40% of our total funding from the federal government. That's higher than the national average. Pretty much all states get, let's say, in the 28% to 30% range. Tennessee gets 40%. It's probably actually higher than that. I heard that number from a few reliable politicians several years ago. It's probably actually higher than 40% now. So when that train wrecks, it's going to be painful here for us in Tennessee. Now, in a lot of other aspects, from what I understand, our overall debt is pretty low in terms of funding our retirement pensions and so on and so forth, and I hear that we're in good shape. That's a great thing, but we need to, right now, before this crash comes, and it's coming eventually, go ahead, start with education, stop selling our kids out for federal dollars, and get our finances in order so that we as a state can provide the education for our kids. The real question is not if we can afford to end federal funding, but if we can afford not to. That's all for tonight. I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch our program. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell to stay informed about our upcoming shows. Also, you can now listen to us as a podcast on Spreaker.com. You can find all the audio-only podcasts podcast on your favorite episodes for our websites, tinformer.com, or do a search for the Tennessee Informer on Spreaker.com, where you can also download the Spreaker app for Android or Apple phones to listen while on the go. Also excited to announce the Tennessee Informer podcast are now available to listen on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google, and several other podcast platforms. Many ways to watch and listen, so stay tuned as we grow and share the message. Also, please take a moment to check out and follow our Facebook page, Tennessee Informer. We'll be posting a lot of news and information on there, as well as our website, tinformer.com, where you can also sign up for a weekly newsletter. Share us with your friends so they can stay up to date and in touch with all the conservative political news and issues concerning our state. The Tennessee Informer also strives to bring you only very best in guests, and next week is no different when our guest will be Lieutenant Colonel retired Fred Shaw, a former Special Forces Army officer who founded the Museum of Military Culture that honors veterans year-round. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.